I stormed into the corporate party, my blood boiling with a mix of fury and disbelief. The ballroom was decked out in the usual glitz, crystal chandeliers casting a soft glow over the polished marble floors, the scent of expensive perfume mingling with the faint notes of jazz drifting from the live band in the corner. But all of that faded into the background as my eyes locked onto a sight that stopped me dead in my tracks. There she was, my wife, wrapped in the arms of her boss, Stanley Cross. He was whispering something in her ear, his hand resting far too comfortably on her lower back. As if that wasn't enough, his adult daughter was off to the side, brazenly flirting with my son, who looked completely lost, caught between discomfort and a teenage fascination with the attention. "What the hell is going on here?" I bellowed, my voice cutting through the room like a knife. The entire room froze, all eyes turning toward me. My wife's face drained of color, her eyes wide with shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Then, as if the very sight of me was too much for her to handle, she fainted, collapsing against Stanley, who barely made an effort to catch her. My daughter, who had been standing beside my wife, turned away, her expression a mix of disgust and shame. She couldn't even look at me. Before I could move, before I could even begin to process the betrayal seeping into my bones, two burly security guards grabbed me by the arms, wrenching me backward. Stanley smirked as he stepped forward, a victorious gleam in his eyes. "You lost, soldier," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "She and your daughter know I'm the best choice for them. It's time you accepted that." I could hardly breathe, let alone respond. The room spun as the guards began to drag me out, the realization hitting me like a freight train. My world had just come crashing down, and the man standing in its ruins was the one who had orchestrated the entire disaster. I was thrown into the back alley behind the Grand Hotel, the door slamming shut behind me. The cold air bit into my skin, a stark contrast to the heat boiling in my chest. I stood there for a moment, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Stanley's words echoed in my mind, taunting me. "You lost, soldier." The bastard had turned my wife against me, and my daughter, my own flesh and blood, seemed to be under his spell too. How the hell had it come to this? I leaned against the rough brick wall, my mind racing back over the past few months, trying to piece together the signs I'd missed. Tracy had been distant lately, coming home later and later from work, her excuses growing thinner by the day. I had brushed it off, thinking it was just the stress of her new role. How could I have been so blind? I wasn't a fool. I'd been through hell in the Marines, survived things that would break most men. But this was different. This was a knife to the heart, a betrayal so deep it left me gasping for air. I kicked a nearby trash can, sending it skidding across the alley. The sound echoed in the emptiness, a brief satisfaction that did nothing to ease the pain gnawing at my insides. I wanted to scream, to tear something apart, but all I could do was stand there, fists clenched, jaw tight, as the reality of the situation settled in. She had fainted at the sight of me, fainted as if she was the one who had been wronged. And my daughter, the one I had always thought of as my little girl, couldn't even bear to look at me. Had Stanley really gotten to both of them? Or was this just the beginning of something even worse? I had to find out. I couldn't just walk away. Not now, not after what I'd seen. But I couldn't just barge back in there either. They'd already thrown me out once, and I knew Stanley would be ready if I tried again. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think clearly. I needed to confront Tracy, but it had to be on my terms. I needed to know exactly what was going on, how deep this betrayal went, and how long it had been festering right under my nose. I pushed off the wall, heading toward the parking lot. My hands were still shaking, my mind a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and a grim determination that was quickly solidifying into a plan. I'd get to the bottom of this, and when I did, there'd be hell to pay. The drive home was a blur. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. the night rushing by in streaks of color as I replayed the scene over and over in my mind. Tracy's lifeless eyes as she fainted, the smirk on Stanley's face, my daughter's disgusted expression. They all merged into one sickening montage. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my rage had settled into something cold and calculating. I was going to get answers tonight no matter what it took. The house was dark, save for the dim glow of the porch light. I stepped out of the car, the night air heavy with the smell of wet grass and earth. My chest tightened as I approached the front door, the silence of the neighborhood pressing in on me. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. I flicked on the hallway light, the sudden brightness making me squint. The place felt empty, like a shell, the warmth that once filled it long gone. I moved through the house, checking room after room. But Tracy wasn't here, neither was my daughter. My mind raced as I tried to figure out where they could be. Then it hit me, the hotel. Stanley must have taken her to one of his fancy suites downtown. The thought of them together in some luxurious room made my blood boil all over again. I was halfway out the door when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart pounding as I saw Tracy's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, letting her sweat it out, but I needed to hear her voice, to confront her with what I'd seen. I swiped to answer and brought the phone to my ear, my voice low and steady. "Where are you?" There was a pause on the other end, a soft intake of breath. "Blake, I'm sorry. I didn't want you to find out this way." Her voice was shaky, but it didn't have the effect she was hoping for. Instead of softening, I felt my anger sharpen, like a blade being honed. "Find out what, Tracy? That you've been screwing your boss behind my back? That you've dragged our daughter into this mess?" "Blake, please let me explain," she pleaded, but her words were drowned out by the roaring in my ears. I was done with her excuses, her lies. "Explain? What is there to explain, Tracy? I saw you tonight with him. You didn't even try to deny it. How long has this been going on? How long have you been making a fool of me?" Another pause, longer this time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. 6 months. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. 6 months, half a year of lies, deceit, and betrayal. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself, but the room seemed to tilt. "And our daughter?" I managed to ask, my voice thick with disbelief. "Is she in on this too? Does she know?" Tracy hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "She doesn't know everything, Blake, but she knows enough. She thinks Stanley can give her a better life, more opportunities." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't just about Tracy's affair. This was about our family, our future, being torn apart by that smug son of a bitch. "You need to come home, Tracy," I said, my voice as calm as I could make it. "We need to talk. Now." There was a long silence on the other end, so long that I wondered if she had hung up. Then she spoke, her voice trembling. "I'll be there in an hour." The line went dead, and I stood there staring at the phone in my hand. I had an hour to prepare for the confrontation of a lifetime. An hour to decide what I was going to do when Tracy walked through that door. An hour to figure out if there was anything left of our marriage to salvage, or if it was time to burn it all to the ground. The hour dragged by like an eternity. I paced the living room, my thoughts spiraling through every possible scenario. How was I supposed to face Tracy after what I'd seen? After what she'd admitted? 6 months of betrayal. 6 months where she'd been playing house with Stanley Cross while I was out here, oblivious, believing in us, believing in her. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second hammering into my skull. I stopped in front of the fireplace, staring at the family photos arranged on the mantel. There was one of us from last summer, a trip to the lake. Tracy was smiling, her arm wrapped around my waist, our daughter in front of us, grinning from ear to ear. We looked so happy, so normal. How could she have faked it so well? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped me out of my thoughts. I moved to the window, peering through the curtains. Tracy stepped out of the car, her movements slow and hesitant. She stood there for a moment, staring at the house, as if gathering the courage to walk inside. I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening as I watched her. She finally started toward the door, her steps heavy with reluctance. I could feel my pulse quicken, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. The door creaked open and Tracy stepped inside. She looked different, more fragile, like the weight of her actions was finally sinking in. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of the woman I used to know, the woman I married. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by someone I barely recognized. "Blake," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading. Don't," I cut her off, my voice hard. "Don't start with apologies or excuses. Just tell me why. Why him? Why now?" She flinched at the harshness in my tone, but she didn't look away. "I never meant for it to happen," she said, her voice trembling. It just did. Stanley. He made me feel wanted, needed. I didn't realize how much I was missing until... Missing? I spat the word out like it was poison. "You've had everything, Tracy. A home, a family, me. And you threw it all away for what? Some sleazy affair with your boss? You think that's love? You think that's what you've been missing?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing, just a cold, hollow emptiness where my heart used to be. She reached out as if to touch my arm, but I recoiled, stepping back. "Please, Blake," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was going to end it, but then things got complicated." "Complicated? You mean like our daughter getting involved? Like you dragging her into this mess?" I snapped. Tracy's face crumpled, and she sank into the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands. "I never wanted her to know," she sobbed. "I didn't want her to hate me." I stared at her, my emotions a chaotic storm inside me. I wanted to scream, to break something, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice level. "She doesn't hate you, Tracy, but she sure as hell doesn't respect you anymore, and neither do I." Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. There was nothing left between us but shattered trust and broken promises. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. I looked at her, feeling the weight of her question settle over me like a heavy shroud. What did I want her to do? Did I want her to leave, to end our marriage here and now? Or did I want her to stay, to try and pick up the pieces of a life she'd so carelessly destroyed? "Come clean," I said, my voice cold and unyielding. "Tell me everything, Tracy. Every lie, every time you were with him. And then we'll see if there's anything left worth saving." She lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. There was a long pause, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Then, with a shaky breath, she began to speak, the words tumbling out like a confession. "It started when Stanley promoted me," she said, her voice a strained whisper. He paid attention to me in a way that you hadn't in a long time. I didn't mean for it to happen, but he made me feel alive again, like I was important. I didn't realize how deep I was in until it was too late." I listened in silence as she unraveled the story of their affair, each word cutting deeper than the last. She told me about the late nights at the office, the business trips that were just an excuse to be with him, the lies she'd fed me to cover her tracks. She spared no detail, and by the time she was done, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Everything I thought I knew turned upside down. When she finished, there was a long, suffocating silence. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the hope that somehow I might find it in me to forgive her, to start over. But all I felt was an overwhelming sense of betrayal, a chasm between us that I didn't know how to bridge. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "But I do know one thing. You're going to tell our daughter everything. She deserves the truth, even if it destroys whatever's left of this family." Tracy nodded, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I will," she whispered. "I'll tell her everything." As she sat there, broken and defeated, I realized that whatever happened next, our lives would never be the same. The trust was gone, the love we once shared now tainted by deceit. And no matter how much I wanted to go back, to fix what had been shattered, I knew deep down that some things could never be repaired. The only question left was how we would move forward, together or apart. The following days were a blur of tense conversations and uncomfortable silences. Tracy stayed at the house, but it felt like we were living in two different worlds. She spent most of her time in the guest room, leaving only to check on our daughter or make a feeble attempt at small talk that I ignored. The truth had been laid bare, but instead of bringing clarity, it only deepened the rift between us. Our daughter, Emma, was another story. She barely spoke to me, her eyes full of a mixture of anger and confusion every time we crossed paths. I knew Tracy had told her everything, and now the weight of our broken family hung heavy in the air, suffocating us all. I spent most of my time trying to process it all, the betrayal, the lies, the fact that my wife had found solace in the arms of another man, and worse, dragged our daughter into the mess. The walls of the house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now seemed to close in on me, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. Late one evening, I was in the living room, staring at the empty fireplace, when Emma walked in. She hesitated in the doorway, and for a moment I thought she was going to turn around and leave. But then she took a deep breath and stepped into the room, her face set in a determined expression that looked far too mature for her age. "Dad, can we talk?" she asked, her voice steady, though I could see the nervousness in her eyes. I nodded, gesturing to the couch. "Of course." She sat down, smoothing her hands over her jeans, avoiding my gaze. I could tell she was struggling to find the right words, so I waited, giving her the time she needed. "Mom told me everything," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About her and Stanley. And about you." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I kept my expression neutral. "I know she did." Emma looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and something else, something that looked like disappointment. "Why didn't you do something sooner, Dad? Why didn't you stop it?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been expecting anger, maybe even some harsh words, but not this. Not the implication that I had somehow allowed this to happen. "Emma," I started, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't know. I didn't see it coming." "But you should have," she snapped, her voice suddenly fierce. "You're supposed to protect us, to protect me, but instead, you let her—" Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands, the tears finally spilling over. I moved to sit beside her, reaching out to pull her into my arms. She resisted at first, but then she collapsed against me, her sobs racking her small frame. I held her tightly, my own eyes burning as I fought back tears. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I should have seen it. I should have done something, but I didn't, and that's on me." She cried harder at that, her fists clenching the fabric of my shirt as if she was trying to hold on to something solid, something that wouldn't crumble beneath her. I stroked her hair, trying to offer what little comfort I could. After a while, her sobs subsided, and she pulled away, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She looked at me, her eyes red and puffy, but there was a steely resolve there now, something that made me both proud and heartbroken. "I hate Stanley," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and sadness. I hate what he's done to us, to you. But I don't know how to feel about Mom. She lied to me, Dad. She betrayed you, but she's still my mom." I nodded, understanding the turmoil she was going through. "It's okay to feel conflicted, Emma. None of this is easy. Your mom made some terrible choices and we're all paying the price. But she's still your mother and she loves you. That hasn't changed." Emma sniffled, looking down at her hands. "I don't know if I can forgive her." I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight. It takes time, and it's okay if you're not ready to forgive her right now. What matters is that you're honest with yourself about how you feel." She nodded slowly, processing my words. "What about you? Can you forgive her?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and painful. I looked at Emma, seeing so much of her mother in her strength, her vulnerability, her stubbornness. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm trying to figure that out myself. But whatever happens between your mom and me, I want you to know that I'm always going to be here for you. We'll get through this together, okay?" Emma looked at me for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Okay." We sat there in silence for a while, the tension between us easing, if only slightly. It was a small step forward, but it was something. I knew the road ahead was going to be long and painful, full of difficult conversations and choices that would change everything. But for the first time in days, I felt like there might be a way through this mess. If not for my marriage, then at least for my daughter's sake. As I watched Emma leave the room, I realized that whatever happened next, I couldn't afford to lose her. She was the only thing keeping me grounded, the only part of my life that still made sense. And if that meant facing my demons and finding a way to coexist with Tracy, then so be it. But one thing was certain: Stanley Cross wasn't going to get away with this. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to make sure he paid for what he'd done to my family. The next morning, I woke up with a clearer head, though the heaviness in my chest hadn't lessened. I went through the motions: coffee, shower, a quick breakfast, each action mechanical, almost robotic. But my mind was somewhere else, piecing together how I could confront Stanley Cross without completely tearing apart what was left of my family. Tracy was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea in her hands. She looked like she hadn't slept all night. Her eyes were red, her face pale, and there was a weariness in her posture that made her look older than she was. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. The silence between us was thick, like a storm waiting to break. I could tell she wanted to say something, but I wasn't in the mood to talk. Not yet. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional sip of our drinks. Finally, Tracy spoke, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I talked to Emma last night." "I know," I replied, not looking at her. "She told me." Tracy nodded, staring into her tea as if it held all the answers. "She's so angry at me. I don't blame her, but it hurts, Blake. It hurts knowing I did this to her, to us." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "What did you expect, Tracy? You lied to her. You lied to both of us, and now you're dealing with the fallout. You made your bed, now you have to lie in it." She flinched at my words, but she didn't argue. Instead, she set her mug down and looked at me, her eyes pleading. "I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you and Emma more than I can ever make up for, but I want to try. I want to fix this, Blake. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I could see that she was genuine, that she really did want to make things right. But the damage was done, and I wasn't sure if there was anything left to salvage. "Fixing this isn't going to be easy," I said, my voice flat. "It's not going to be a quick fix or something we can just talk our way out of. You made a choice, Tracy. A choice that tore this family apart. And now you want to put it back together like nothing happened? I don't know if that's possible." She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to take mine. I pulled back, not ready to give her that comfort. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't withdraw. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," she whispered. "I'll quit my job, I'll go to counseling, I'll do anything you ask. Just, please don't give up on us, don't give up on me." The sincerity in her voice was undeniable, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the love we once shared. But it was buried under layers of betrayal and anger, and I wasn't sure if I could dig it out. "I don't know, Tracy," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can just forgive and forget what you did with Stanley. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice, a deliberate choice to betray me, to betray our family." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, stopping her. "I need time to think. We can't just rush into this, pretending everything can go back to normal. Because it can't. Not after this." Her face crumpled, and she nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I understand," she whispered. "I'll give you time, as much as you need. Just, please, don't shut me out completely." I didn't respond, just stood up from the table and walked out of the kitchen, needing space. I could feel her eyes on me as I left, but I didn't look back. I spent the day driving aimlessly around town, my mind a chaotic mess of emotions. Every corner I turned, every familiar sight reminded me of the life we had built together. A life that now felt like it was slipping through my fingers. At some point, I ended up at the park where I used to take Emma when she was little. The playground was empty, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. I sat on a bench, staring out at the empty slides and jungle gyms, lost in thought. I tried to picture what life would be like if I walked away from it all, if I left Tracy, left the memories behind, and started fresh. But every time I imagined it, I saw Emma's face, saw the pain in her eyes, and I knew I couldn't do that to her. She needed stability, needed both of her parents in her life, but could I really stay, knowing what Tracy had done? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, I made a decision. I wasn't going to make any rash moves. I would give Tracy the time she asked for, see if there was any way to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But I wouldn't let Stanley Cross get away with what he had done. When I got home, Tracy was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up as I walked in, her expression a mix of hope and fear. "I've been thinking," I said, standing in the doorway. "I'm not making any promises. I don't know if we can fix this, but I'm willing to try, for Emma's sake, if nothing else." Tracy let out a shaky breath, nodding. "Thank you, Blake. That's all I can ask for." "But there's one condition," I added, my voice hardening. "I'm going to deal with Stanley. He's not getting away with this." Her eyes widened in alarm, but she quickly nodded. "Okay, just, please, be careful." I gave her a curt nod and walked upstairs, leaving her in the living room. I didn't know exactly how I was going to make Stanley pay, but I knew I had to do something. He had taken everything from me, and I wasn't about to let him walk away unscathed. As I lay in bed that night, the house quiet around me, I knew that whatever came next, it wasn't going to be easy. But I was ready. For Tracy, for Emma, and for myself. I was going to fight. And I was going to make damn sure that Stanley Cross regretted ever thinking he could destroy my family. The following week was a tense stalemate between Tracy and me. We coexisted in the same house, exchanged brief words when necessary, but mostly kept our distance. Tracy's attempts to bridge the gap between us felt forced, and I wasn't ready to meet her halfway. The wounds were still too fresh, and every time I looked at her, all I could see was her betrayal. Emma was caught in the middle, and I hated that. She avoided both of us as much as she could, spending most of her time in her room or out with friends. I knew she was hurting, trying to process everything that had happened, but I didn't know how to help her without confronting my own pain. Meanwhile, my anger toward Stanley Cross festered, growing more intense with each passing day. I couldn't shake the image of him, smug and triumphant, taunting me at that party. He had destroyed my marriage, poisoned my family, and he thought he could get away with it. I wasn't going to let that happen. But I couldn't just walk into his office and beat the hell out of him, as satisfying as that thought was. I needed a plan, something that would hit him where it hurt the most: his reputation, his career, his life. I had no doubt that Stanley was a man with enemies, and if I could find the right leverage, I could bring him down. One evening, after another awkward dinner with Tracy and Emma, I retreated to my office and started digging. I knew Stanley's law firm was one of the most powerful in the city, with connections that ran deep in political and corporate circles. But power like that always came with skeletons in the closet. I was determined to find them. Hours passed as I combed through public records, news articles, anything I could find that might give me a lead. I knew it was a long shot. Stanley wasn't the type to leave a paper trail, but I was fueled by the need for justice, for revenge. I wasn't just doing this for myself. I was doing it for Emma, for the life that Stanley had ripped apart. Finally, I stumbled across something that caught my attention. It was an old article buried deep in the archives, barely a blip on the radar at the time, but now it felt like a smoking gun. A former employee of Stanley's firm had filed a lawsuit against him years ago, accusing him of sexual harassment and wrongful termination. The case had been settled out of court, quietly swept under the rug, but the details were damning. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. This was it. My way in. If I could find this woman, get her to talk, I could blow Stanley's life apart. The only problem was that she had seemingly disappeared after the settlement. No social media, no online presence, nothing. It was like she had vanished. But I wasn't about to give up. I jotted down the few details I could find: her name, the date of the lawsuit, the attorneys involved, and decided to start making calls in the morning. If there was one thing I knew from my time in the military, it was that no one could stay hidden forever. The next day, I left the house early, telling Tracy I had some errands to run. She didn't ask for details, just nodded, and I could see the worry in her eyes as I walked out the door. She knew I was up to something, but she didn't press. Maybe she was afraid of what I might say if she did. I spent the morning making calls, tracking down anyone who might know where the woman, Lauren Avery, had gone after the lawsuit. Most people were tight-lipped, clearly reluctant to talk about anything related to Stanley Cross, but eventually I got a break. One of her former co-workers mentioned that she had moved out of state to a small town in Oregon. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I booked a flight for the next day, determined to find her and see if she'd be willing to help me bring Stanley down. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flight confirmation on my phone. Tracy walked in, her eyes flicking to the screen, then back to me. "You're going somewhere?" she asked, her voice careful, like she was trying not to provoke me. "I have to take care of something," I replied, my tone clipped. "I'll be back in a few days." She hesitated, then nodded, clearly wanting to say more but holding back. "Be careful, Blake." I looked at her, seeing the worry etched on her face. For a moment, I almost felt a pang of guilt, leaving her in the dark like this, letting her stew in her own fears. But then I remembered why I was doing this, and any sympathy I felt for her evaporated. "I will," I said, standing up and brushing past her. "But don't expect things to be the same when I get back." She didn't respond, just stood there, watching me leave. I could feel her eyes on my back as I walked upstairs to pack, but I didn't look back. The next morning, I was on a plane to Oregon, my mind focused on one thing: finding Lauren Avery and getting her to tell me everything she knew about Stanley Cross. If she was willing to talk, I knew I could use her story to destroy him, and I wasn't going to stop until I saw his world crumble the way he had made mine. The flight was long, giving me too much time to think. As the plane cut through the clouds, I replayed everything that had happened in the past few weeks. Tracy's confession, the awkward silences, Emma's heartbreak, Stanley's smug face at the party. All of it led to this moment, this desperate gamble to take back control of my life. When we landed, I rented a car and drove straight to the small town where Lauren Avery had supposedly moved. It was a quiet place, nestled in the mountains, far removed from the chaos of the city. As I pulled into the driveway of the address I'd been given, I felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with dread. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew it was my best shot. I walked up to the front door and knocked, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a woman in her late 30s with tired eyes and a wary expression stood before me. I recognized her from the grainy photo I had seen in the article. This was Lauren Avery. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Lauren Avery?" I asked, and she nodded slowly, suspicion clouding her features. "Yes. Who are you?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "My name is Blake. I need to talk to you about Stanley Cross." Her face immediately hardened, and she started to close the door. "I don't want any trouble. Please, just go." "Wait," I said, pressing my hand against the door. "Please, just hear me out. I know what he did to you, and I want to help. I want to take him down." She paused, her eyes searching mine for any hint of deception. After what felt like an eternity, she slowly opened the door wider, letting me in. "Come in," she said quietly. "But if you're lying to me, I'll make sure you regret it." I stepped inside, knowing that this was the beginning of the end for Stanley Cross. One way or another, I was going to make sure he paid for everything he had done. Lauren led me into a modest living room, the kind of place that felt lived in, comfortable, but with an edge of weariness. It was clear that she'd been through a lot. She motioned for me to sit on the couch, while she took a seat in an armchair opposite me, her eyes never leaving mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, like we were two animals circling each other, waiting to see who would make the first move. I could tell she was still trying to figure me out, deciding whether she could trust me or if I was just another threat. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said finally, breaking the silence. "I'm here because Stanley Cross has done something unforgivable, and I want to make sure he never does it again." She narrowed her eyes, her posture stiffening. "You're not the first person to come looking for dirt on Stanley. Why should I trust you?" I leaned forward, trying to project as much sincerity as I could. "Because I've been where you are. He's destroyed my life too, Lauren. He had an affair with my wife. He's torn my family apart. I need to stop him, and I think you're the only person who can help me do that." Lauren's expression softened slightly, but there was still a guardedness in her eyes. "I lost everything because of him," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "My career, my reputation, my sense of safety. It all went up in smoke the moment I stood up to him." She looked down at her hands, twisting them together as if she was wrestling with something deep inside her. "I wanted to fight, you know? I wanted to drag him through the mud, expose him for the predator he is. But he was too powerful. He had all the resources, all the connections. I was just nobody." I could hear the pain in her voice, the raw wound that still hadn't healed. It mirrored my own in so many ways. "I'm sorry for what you went through," I said quietly. "But you're not nobody, Lauren. You're someone who stood up against a monster, and I'm asking you to do it again, this time with someone who has just as much to lose." She met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope. But it was quickly snuffed out as she shook her head. "Even if I wanted to help, what can I do? I signed an NDA when we settled. I'm legally bound not to say anything." "NDAs can be challenged," I replied, the gears in my mind turning, especially if they were signed under duress, or if they're being used to cover up criminal behavior. Stanley's power is built on fear and silence. If we can break that, we can take him down." She hesitated. the conflict clear on her face. I could see she was considering it, weighing the risks against the chance to finally get justice. I knew it wasn't an easy decision. It would mean dragging herself back into the nightmare she had tried so hard to escape. But I also knew that if she didn't, Stanley would continue his reign of terror unchecked. "What's your plan?" she asked, her voice steadying. I took a deep breath, grateful that she was at least willing to listen. "I need you to go on record with what happened to you. If we can get your story out there, we can create a public outcry that Stanley won't be able to ignore. The media loves a scandal, especially when it involves a powerful man getting his comeuppance. Once your story is out, it'll give other victims the courage to come forward. We can build a case, expose him for what he really is." She stared at me, weighing my words carefully. "And what happens if I do this? What happens to me?" "We'll protect you," I promised, though I knew it was a heavy promise to make. "I'll use whatever resources I have to make sure you're safe, and you won't be alone this time. You'll have me, and I'll find others who will stand with you. Stanley's power lies in isolating his victims, but if we unite, we can bring him down." Lauren was silent for a long moment, her eyes flickering with a mix of fear and determination. I could see the battle raging inside her, the instinct to protect herself warring with the desire for justice. Finally, she looked up at me, a steely resolve in her gaze. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "I'll do it. I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. If this is my chance to finally get back at him, then I'm in." Relief washed over me, though I knew this was only the beginning. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "You have no idea how much this means, to me, to everyone he's hurt." She nodded, but there was a weariness in her eyes that told me she knew exactly what she was signing up for. "I know what I'm risking," she said quietly, "but I can't live with myself if I keep hiding. He has to be stopped." I reached across the table, offering my hand. "We'll do it together. We'll make sure he pays for everything." She hesitated, then took my hand, her grip firm and determined. "Together," she echoed. As I left Lauren's house, a sense of purpose filled me, stronger than anything I'd felt in weeks. For the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my life again, striking back against the man who had ripped it apart. But as I drove away, my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a text from Tracy. "We need to talk. It's important." I frowned, a sense of unease creeping over me. Tracy had been giving me space, respecting my silence. For her to reach out now, it had to be something serious. I texted back, "I'll call you later. I'm busy." But even as I sent the message, a part of me knew that whatever she had to say, it wasn't going to be good. I shoved the phone into my pocket and focused on the road ahead, pushing down the anxiety gnawing at the edges of my mind. For now, I had a plan to execute. Stanley Cross was going down, and nothing was going to stop me from seeing it through. As I drove away from Lauren's place, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut after Tracy's message. Something in the way she'd phrased it, "We need to talk. It's important," felt different, urgent in a way that made my instincts flare up. I pushed the thought aside, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. Stanley was my priority right now. Tracy could wait. I spent the next few hours in a nearby cafe, sketching out a plan with Lauren. We needed to move quickly before Stanley got wind of what we were up to. She agreed to gather any evidence she still had from her time at the firm, emails, documents, anything that could help build our case. We also discussed potential media outlets that might be willing to run her story. It was risky, but the more exposure we got, the harder it would be for Stanley to silence us. By the time we wrapped up, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the small town. I walked Lauren back to her house, the quiet resolve in her steps mirroring my own. We both knew that once we set this plan in motion, there would be no turning back. "Thank you for doing this," I said as we reached her door. I know it's not easy. She offered a small, tired smile. It's the right thing to do. I'm tired of being scared. I nodded, understanding all too well. I'll be in touch. We'll coordinate everything before we go public. With a final nod, she disappeared inside, leaving me standing on the porch. I turned back toward the car, feeling the weight of what we were about to do settle over me. It was a heavy burden, but one I was willing to carry. As I got into the car, I checked my phone. Tracy had sent another message. Please call me. It's about Emma. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. What's going on? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Tracy's voice came through, strained and thick with emotion. Blake, Emma's gone. Gone? I repeated, my mind struggling to process the word. What do you mean, gone? She left a note, Tracy said, her voice cracking. She's run away, Blake. She said she couldn't handle this anymore, couldn't handle us. She's gone, and I don't know where she is. Panic shot through me like a bolt of lightning. Did you call the police? Yes, but they said we have to wait, she replied, her voice trembling. They're treating it like a runaway situation. They don't think she's in immediate danger. But Blake, she's our little girl. I don't know what to do. My mind was reeling, my thoughts racing in 1,000 different directions. How could this be happening? Emma was strong, stronger than most kids her age, but she was still just a kid. What had driven her to this? Was it the tension between Tracy and me or something else entirely? I'm coming home, I said, my voice firm despite the panic clawing at my insides. We'll find her, Tracy. I'll find her. Please hurry, she whispered, and I could hear the tears in her voice. I'm scared, Blake. I don't want to lose her. You won't, I promised, though I wasn't sure if I was reassuring her or myself. I'm on my way. I hung up and started the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. Everything that had been fueling me, the anger, the need for revenge, the determination to bring Stanley down, suddenly seemed so insignificant in the face of this new crisis. My daughter was missing and nothing else mattered. The drive back felt like an eternity. I couldn't stop the flood of worst-case scenarios running through my mind. Was she out on the streets, alone and scared? Had something happened to her? Or was she hiding somewhere, waiting for me to find her? Every minute that passed without knowing where she was felt like another punch to the gut. When I finally pulled into the driveway, Tracy was waiting for me on the porch, her face pale and tear-streaked. She rushed toward me as I got out of the car, her hands shaking as she held out the note Emma had left. I took it from her, my heart pounding as I unfolded the crumpled piece of paper. The words were scrawled hastily, as if Emma had been fighting back tears while she wrote them. Mom, Dad, I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. I can't stay here and pretend that everything's okay when it's not. You're both so angry all the time, and it feels like I'm stuck in the middle, suffocating. I need to get away, to think. Please don't try to find me. I just need some time. I love you both, but I can't stay here right now. I hope you can understand. Emma. I stared at the note, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. This was my fault. I'd been so focused on my own pain, my own need for revenge, that I hadn't seen what this was doing to Emma. She was just a kid, and she'd been caught in the crossfire of our mess. She's been so quiet lately, Tracy said, her voice shaking. I thought she was just dealing with it in her own way. But I never thought she'd... Blake, what are we going to do? I clenched the note in my hand, trying to keep my voice steady. We'll find her. She can't have gone far. But even as I said the words, I knew that finding Emma wasn't going to be easy. She was smart, resourceful, and if she didn't want to be found, she'd make sure we couldn't find her. Tracy collapsed into my arms, sobbing, and for the first time in weeks, I held her, trying to comfort her, even though I felt like I was drowning in my own guilt and fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my chest. "I'm so sorry, Blake. I never wanted this." "Neither did I replied, my voice hoarse. "But we have to fix it. We have to find her." I gently pulled away and took out my phone, dialing the police. Tracy's words echoed in my mind as I waited for them to answer. "I'm scared, Blake. I don't want to lose her." Neither did I, but I couldn't help feeling like I was already losing everything that mattered. As the phone rang, I steeled myself, knowing that whatever it took, I was going to find my daughter. And when I did, I was going to make damn sure she knew that no matter how broken our family was, she would always have a place in it. The police arrived shortly after I hung up. 2 officers, a middle-aged man with a tired expression and a younger woman with a sympathetic smile. They asked the standard questions, trying to piece together Emma's last known whereabouts. Tracy answered most of their questions, her voice trembling as she recounted the past few days, how distant Emma had become, how they hadn't realized just how much she was struggling. I stood off to the side, my hands balled into fists, fighting the urge to scream at them to hurry up, to do something. Every second they spent asking questions felt like another second wasted, another moment that Emma was out there alone. "We'll put out a bulletin," the male officer said, scribbling notes in his pad. "We'll check with her friends, see if anyone's seen her. It's possible she's just staying with someone she trusts, trying to get some space." "And if she's not?" I asked, my voice rough, my patience frayed. The officer hesitated, then looked at me with a level of calm that felt like a slap in the face. "If she's not, we'll expand the search. But right now, the best thing you can do is stay home, keep your phone close in case she tries to contact you." Tracy nodded, but I could see the same fear in her eyes that was tearing me apart inside. She was holding it together, barely, but I knew the cracks were there, ready to split wide open at any moment. After the officers left, I sat down on the edge of the couch, staring at the spot where Emma had last been. My mind raced through every possible place she could have gone, friends' houses, familiar haunts, maybe even the old treehouse in the woods where she used to play as a little girl. But none of it felt right. She was too smart to go somewhere obvious. "I don't know what to do," Tracy whispered, sitting beside me. Her hands were trembling, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I thought we were going to lose each other, but I never thought we'd lose her." "We haven't lost her," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was saying it to comfort her or convince myself. "We'll find her, Tracy. We have to." Tracy nodded, but I could see the doubt creeping into her expression, the fear that maybe, just maybe, we wouldn't. And that fear was tearing me apart. The hours dragged on, each one stretching out like an eternity. I kept my phone in my hand, waiting, hoping for a call or a text from Emma, something to let me know she was okay. But there was nothing. Tracy tried calling Emma's friends, but no one had seen her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. By midnight, my nerves were shot. I couldn't sit still any longer. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, determined to search every inch of the town if I had to. "Where are you going?" Tracy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't just sit here," I replied, my hand on the doorknob. "I need to do something." She didn't argue, just nodded, the same helplessness I felt reflected in her eyes. "Be careful, Blake, please." "I will," I promised, though the words felt hollow. There was no being careful in a situation like this. There was only finding Emma, whatever it took. I drove through the empty streets, the town dark and quiet, the only light coming from the occasional street lamp. My mind was a whirl of thoughts, memories, all centered around Emma. I thought of the times we'd spent together, the moments that made me realize just how much she meant to me, how much I loved her. As I drove, I found myself heading toward the old treehouse in the woods on the outskirts of town. It was a long shot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be there, hiding out in a place that once brought her comfort. I remembered the hours she used to spend up there, reading books, playing games, just being a kid. Maybe she'd gone back there, seeking some semblance of peace amidst the chaos we'd created. When I reached the edge of the woods, I parked the car and got out, the cold night air biting at my skin. The trees loomed dark and imposing, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I hadn't been to the treehouse in years, not since Emma had outgrown it, but I remembered the path well enough. I made my way through the woods, the underbrush crunching under my boots, the shadows deepening as I moved farther from the road. The treehouse wasn't far, just a short hike into the woods, but in the darkness, it felt like miles. Finally, I saw it, the outline of the old wooden structure silhouetted against the night sky. The ladder was still there, though it looked worn and rickety, the wood splintered from years of neglect. I climbed up, the wood creaking under my weight, praying that it wouldn't give out.